The storm hit with an unrelenting fury, a dark wall of rain and wind that swallowed the small town whole. The air was thick with tension, and the only sounds were the screeching of the wind and the heavy thud of raindrops slamming against the windows. In the midst of it all, Captain Marcus Williams, a black pilot, gripped the controls of his small aircraft, eyes scanning the sky. His flight had been turbulent from the start, but now, with the storm worsening by the second, he knew his chances of making it to the next airport were slim. As his plane descended into the remote, isolated town, Marcus' mind raced. He had no choice but to land. The fuel was low, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. A small town just on the outskirts of the main flight path, he had never heard of it, but that didn't matter now. All that mattered was getting on the ground safely. He could see the town's dim lights through the storm, and his heart sank. The runway was barely visible, but he knew he had no other choice. With a deep breath, Marcus guided the plane down, the wind battering against the aircraft as it hit the tarmac with a harsh jolt. The engine sputtered and cut out, leaving Marcus in the deafening silence of the storm. He quickly unbuckled his seatbelt and grabbed his emergency kit, stepping out of the aircraft and into the harsh rain. The town seemed deserted, its empty streets hidden beneath layers of water. The storm had claimed it, leaving it isolated from the outside world. There was no time to waste. Marcus began to move toward what appeared to be a small gas station just across the way. The storm was relentless, and he needed shelter, something to ride out the worst of the night. His mind was still on his mission, medical supplies, but first, he had to find some kind of shelter before the storm tore everything apart. As he approached the gas station, Marcus noticed the faint glow of a nearby diner. He quickened his pace, feeling the stinging rain on his face. The feeling of dread lingered in the air, something wasn't right. He reached the door of the diner and yanked it open, the wind threatening to rip it out of his hands. He stepped inside and was immediately met by the smell of old coffee and greasy food. The diner was small, dimly lit, and empty, save for a single figure seated at the counter. A police officer. His uniform was damp from the rain, and his gaze was cold as it flicked over Marcus. The man's eyes narrowed as soon as he saw the black pilot. Marcus couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine. Something about the officer's gaze made him uneasy. But he ignored the feeling, hoping the officer would just be another face to pass the time with until the storm cleared. The officer, however, had other plans. Without a word, he stood up, his boots clacking against the linoleum floor as he approached Marcus. "You're not from around here," the officer said, his voice harsh and clipped. "What are you doing here?" Marcus frowned, surprised by the officer's sudden confrontation. "Just landed," he replied. "I need shelter from the storm." The officer's eyes flicked over Marcus again, his gaze lingering longer than necessary. There was a distinct coldness in his expression. "Ain't no place for people like you around here," he muttered, almost to himself, though loud enough for Marcus to hear. Marcus' heart skipped a beat, but he kept his cool. "I'm just here for shelter, that's all," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The officer ignored him, instead turning his attention to the door as the storm raged outside. It was clear that he wasn't ready to let the situation slide. "I don't trust you," the officer said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think you can just land here and expect help? I've seen your kind before." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He had been in similar situations before, but this felt different. There was something darker in the officer's words, a sharpness that made Marcus' instincts scream. His eyes scanned the room, looking for an exit. The officer stepped closer, blocking his way. "What's your name?" the officer asked, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Marcus Williams," the pilot answered, not sure what to make of the situation. The officer snorted. "Sounds like a fake name," he muttered, his hand sliding down to the baton at his belt. Marcus could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Before Marcus could respond, the officer lunged at him, shoving him backward into the counter. The force of the officer's attack knocked the air from Marcus' lungs, and he stumbled back, nearly falling to the ground. The officer's hand closed around his collar, and he slammed him against the diner's wall. "You're not welcome here," the officer snarled, his breath hot against Marcus' face. Marcus, his heart pounding, struggled to push the officer off of him. He didn't want trouble, but he couldn't let this man treat him like this. With one swift motion, he shoved the officer back, causing him to stumble. The officer, enraged, pulled out his baton, swinging it toward Marcus. The blow landed hard on Marcus' side, causing him to gasp in pain. But he didn't fight back. Not yet. He knew that violence would only escalate the situation. But something strange happened. The storm outside intensified even more, and as the wind howled, the lights in the diner flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. For a brief moment, Marcus could have sworn he saw something, a shadow, moving on its own, at the edge of his vision. The officer froze, his baton still raised, his eyes wide as he scanned the room. There was something in the air, something that wasn't natural. The temperature in the room seemed to drop suddenly, and the smell of damp earth mixed with the strong scent of mildew. The cop's grip on the baton loosened, and he looked around, visibly shaken. "You feel that?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the strange occurrence. The officer didn't respond, his eyes darting around the room, unsettled. The storm outside was no longer just a natural occurrence. It was as if the storm had a life of its own, and something dark had woken within it. Marcus didn't know what was happening, but he felt the weight of the moment settle into his chest. This wasn't just a random confrontation anymore. Something far worse was unfolding. Marcus stood frozen, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The officer was no longer looking at him. His attention was fixed on something in the air above them, his face pale with fear. The wind howled through the diner, rattling the windows. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, the world outside, the chaos within. It was as if time had stopped, leaving only the two men in a tense, suspended reality. Marcus's senses were on high alert. He could feel it now, an oppressive weight in the air, the very atmosphere charged with something malevolent. The officer's grip on his baton trembled, and his eyes darted around, frantic, as if searching for something he couldn't see but felt closing in on him. "What the hell is going on?" the officer whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm's roar. Marcus didn't answer. His gaze followed the officer's, trying to make sense of the strange energy that filled the room. The temperature had dropped, and a faint whisper seemed to echo in the back of his mind, like a distant voice calling him. He shook his head, trying to clear it. There was no time for this, not now. "Is there something you're not telling me?" Marcus asked, his tone firm despite the unease he felt. The officer blinked, still transfixed by whatever unseen force had gripped the diner. "You should leave. This place, it's cursed," he muttered, almost to himself. "You don't know what you're walking into." The words hit Marcus with the weight of a punch. Cursed? He had heard rumors about towns like this, places where the past lingered like a ghost, haunting every corner. But he didn't believe in curses. Not until now. "What happened here?" Marcus pressed, his mind racing. The officer didn't respond at first. His eyes were wide, filled with an almost childlike terror. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice cracking. "This town, it's built on blood. People died here, wrongfully, because of men like me. And now..." He trailed off, his voice faltering as he looked around, as if expecting the walls themselves to collapse. Marcus had heard enough. This town, this officer, they were linked to something darker than any storm could cause. He stepped forward, trying to keep his tone calm. "What are you talking about? What did you do?" The officer's lips trembled, and he seemed to shrink under the weight of the question. He glanced at Marcus for the first time, truly looking at him, not as a threat, not as an outsider, but as someone who might understand. "I've been part of it," he admitted. "I've turned a blind eye to the killings, the injustices. I've helped cover it all up. And now, they're coming for me." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine, not from the cold but from the officer's words. He had suspected something was wrong, but hearing it confirmed left him speechless. This wasn't just a storm. This was something personal, something deeply tied to the officer's sins, and now, Marcus was in the middle of it. Before he could respond, the ground beneath them trembled, a low rumble shaking the diner. The officer flinched, his hand shooting out as if trying to steady himself. The lights flickered again, casting eerie shadows that danced across the room. And then, from the corner of the room, a figure materialized. It was a woman. Her features were distorted, her eyes dark voids, as if nothing remained behind them but the hollow echoes of a lost soul. Her clothes were tattered, stained with something that looked too much like blood. The air grew heavier as she moved, an oppressive presence that seemed to fill the entire room. The officer gasped, stumbling back, his face paling even further. No! No, not her! Not her! The figure didn't speak, but her presence was enough. Marcus felt the weight of her anger, her grief, her pain. It radiated from her in waves, a suffocating force that threatened to break him down. "What is this?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. This is what we've done," the officer whispered, his voice trembling. "These are the ones we killed, the ones we hurt. And now they've come back for revenge." Marcus's mind raced. The woman before them was a ghost, a spirit from the past, but what was she doing here? Why now? The officer's admission, his trembling, the supernatural force surrounding them, it all clicked together in an instant. The officer had been part of the violence, part of the hate that had stained this town's history. And now, that history was coming back to claim him. The figure reached out, her hand a mere few inches from the officer's face. He screamed, the sound raw and filled with terror, but the woman didn't move. She simply hovered there, her empty gaze locked on him, as if judging him, as if waiting for something. The storm outside had died down slightly, the wind still howling but no longer with the same intensity. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the supernatural energy in the room almost tangible. Marcus felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then, the woman spoke, her voice cold and distant. "You are guilty," she said, her words seeping into Marcus's very bones. "You stand here, unrepentant, and yet you've failed to see the consequences of your actions. You've caused pain that stretches beyond your understanding." The officer fell to his knees, his hands pressed against his face in a desperate attempt to block out the words. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I never meant for any of this to happen. Please, I didn't know." The woman didn't answer. She simply reached forward, her hand passing through his face, and the officer screamed, his body convulsing as if struck by an unseen force. Marcus stepped back, unable to look away, his mind racing as he tried to comprehend what was happening. This wasn't just a punishment. This was something more, something deep and primal. As the officer's screams echoed through the diner, the storm outside began to pick up again, the wind howling as if answering the cry of the haunted spirits within the diner's walls. Marcus stood there, paralyzed, torn between his desire to help the officer and the sheer terror of the situation. This wasn't just a storm anymore. This was a reckoning. The officer's cries echoed through the diner, a sound filled with pain and terror. He collapsed onto the floor, his hands clutching at his chest, as if the weight of his guilt was physically crushing him. The woman's spectral form stood over him, her presence like a vice grip around the officer's soul, squeezing the life out of him with every passing second. Her hollow eyes locked onto his, and it was clear she was not there to offer mercy. Marcus couldn't move. His body was frozen in place, his mind struggling to comprehend the reality unfolding before him. This was no ordinary encounter. The supernatural was real, and it was here, in this small, forsaken diner, extracting retribution for the sins of the past. He could see the officer's face contorted with fear, his breath ragged as he pleaded for forgiveness, but the spirit showed no sign of yielding. "I'm sorry!" the officer screamed, his voice breaking. "Please! I didn't know. I was just doing my job. I never wanted to hurt anyone." The words fell from his lips like empty promises, and the woman didn't flinch. Her hand hovered over him, and with each breath the officer took, Marcus could feel the storm outside intensifying, the wind howling as if urging the spirit to continue her reckoning. It was as if the entire world was reacting to the officer's pleas, the town, the storm, and even the spirits that had been wronged by men like him. There was no escaping this judgment. Marcus could feel the weight of the officer's past sins hanging in the air, suffocating everything in the room. But something gnawed at him, something deeper than just the officer's guilt. This town, this storm, and the spirits were all connected. The woman's appearance was not a random event. It was the manifestation of years of injustice, a culmination of hatred and prejudice that had been buried beneath the surface for far too long. The officer wasn't the only one here who had been affected by this darkness. He stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, his eyes on the woman as she loomed over the officer. The spectral figure seemed to notice him, her gaze shifting, and for a brief moment, Marcus felt as if he was being weighed, measured. She didn't speak, but her presence alone was enough to tell him she knew who he was. And for the first time, Marcus realized something he hadn't fully grasped. He wasn't just witnessing this event. He was part of it. "What do you want from him?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. The woman didn't respond, but Marcus could feel the shift in the air. The storm outside grew louder, the winds battering the diner's walls, but the spirit remained still, her eyes never leaving the officer's face. Marcus wasn't sure what he was expecting, but this silence, was almost worse. The weight of her judgment was almost unbearable. The officer, still writhing on the floor, let out another desperate sob. "Please, please, don't hurt me. I didn't deserve this." Marcus felt a strange wave of pity for the officer. He knew the man's actions had been wrong, but there was something about this punishment, this overwhelming force that seemed to be closing in on him, that made Marcus question the nature of justice. Was this truly the right course? Was this supernatural vengeance truly the answer? But the more Marcus thought about it, the more he understood. This wasn't about what the officer deserved. This was about what the town had suffered, the people who had been erased from the history of this place. The officer wasn't the only one who needed to face the consequences of his actions. The town itself had to reckon with its past. Without realizing it, Marcus took another step forward, his voice firm and commanding. "Let him go. He's paying for his sins, but what about the town? What about the others who helped bury this?" The air in the diner shifted again, the temperature dropping even lower. The officer, still curled on the floor, lifted his head, his eyes filled with disbelief. For a moment, Marcus thought he had lost his mind. Was he speaking to a ghost? A spirit from the past? But no, he wasn't speaking to the woman. He was speaking to something far bigger than her, a force that had been festering in this town, a force that had been built on hatred and discrimination. The woman's form flickered, her outline shimmering as though her very existence was uncertain. For a brief instant, it seemed as if she was fading, her presence receding. Marcus felt a pull, a sense of urgency. This wasn't just the spirit's doing, there was more to this storm, more to this town, than he could see. Suddenly, the door of the diner slammed open, the wind howling louder than ever, carrying with it the voices of many. Marcus turned, his heart racing as the shadows in the diner seemed to stretch, reaching across the floor like hands from the past. It wasn't just the woman's spirit now. Others were coming, figures from the past, the ones who had died here, wronged by the system, by the town, by men like the officer. Their faces blurred, but their presence was undeniable. The officer's eyes widened in terror, his mouth opening to scream, but no sound came out. The spirits closed in, surrounding him, their cold presence suffocating. Marcus could feel their rage, their pain, and for the first time, he understood that this was not just one man's reckoning. This was a town's reckoning, and it would not stop until the sins of the past were acknowledged. The officer struggled, his body twitching as the spirits surrounded him. They weren't attacking him physically, but he could feel their judgment. The very weight of their anger pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. "I didn't know," the officer gasped, his voice barely a whisper. The spirits, though, were not there to listen to his excuses. Their presence was the judgment, and it was final. Marcus stepped forward again, his voice stronger this time. "What do you want from us? What do we need to do to make this right?" The spirits didn't respond directly, but their presence seemed to shift, as if considering Marcus's words. The winds outside picked up again, shaking the walls of the diner, and the lights flickered once more, casting long, twisted shadows. In that moment, Marcus knew what he had to do. He wasn't just here to witness this reckoning. He had to be the one to stand up for what was right, not just for the officer, but for the spirits, who had never had the chance to seek justice. The officer's fate was sealed. The spirits had come for him, and there was no turning back. But Marcus, he still had a choice. He could turn away and leave this town to its fate, or he could stand with the spirits, stand against the darkness that had held this town in its grip for so long. And he knew, without a doubt, that he would choose the latter. The storm outside raged like a beast, its fury intensifying as the spirits began to close in on the officer. Marcus stood motionless, his body a conduit for the weight of history. The air felt thicker with every passing second, each breath laden with the pain of the town's forgotten past. The officer, now curled up on the floor, was no longer the proud figure of authority. He was reduced to a trembling shell of a man, overwhelmed by the collective force of the spirits who had once been silenced. It wasn't just the officer's guilt that haunted the room. The town itself was paying for years of injustice, years of silent complicity in the face of violence, hatred, and prejudice. The spirits, their forms shifting in and out of view, represented the very fabric of a society that had turned a blind eye to the suffering of others. Marcus could feel their anger, their anguish, their desperate need for acknowledgement. This wasn't just a reckoning for the officer. It was a reckoning for everyone. The officer's hands clenched into fists, as if he were trying to fight back the overwhelming presence around him. His lips trembled as he struggled to form words, but no sound came out. He was suffocating, trapped in the overwhelming weight of his actions, unable to escape the suffocating grip of the spirits. Marcus watched, his heart heavy with the weight of the moment. There was no easy way out for the officer, no quick fix to undo the damage he had done. But the question that lingered in Marcus' mind was, what did justice look like now? Was it revenge? Was it punishment? Or was there a chance for redemption, even for someone like this officer? Suddenly, a voice broke through the din of the storm. It wasn't the officers. It wasn't even the woman's who had first appeared before them. It was a deeper, more resonant voice, like the sound of thunder rumbling from the heavens. "Enough!" the voice commanded, and for a moment the spirits paused, their swirling forms growing still. Marcus turned, trying to locate the source of the voice, but the shadows were too thick to make out any distinct figure. The air itself seemed to shift as though the storm outside had infiltrated the very fabric of reality. The spirits, frozen in place, looked as though they were waiting for something, for an answer, for the next move. And for the first time since arriving in the diner, Marcus felt like he wasn't alone in this battle. "Justice is not revenge," the voice continued, its tone commanding yet strangely calm. "This town, its people, all must be held accountable, but so too must we remember that redemption is not beyond reach." The officer, who had been silent up until now, let out a strangled sob. "I never meant for this to happen. I didn't know. Please let me make it right." The voice did not respond immediately. The spirits around him shifted, their forms flickering in and out, their anger palpable, but there was something different in the air now. Marcus could feel it too, a shift in the atmosphere, a change in the dynamics of the room. It wasn't just about vengeance anymore. It was about understanding. It was about healing. Slowly, the spirits began to dissipate, their forms fading as if retreating into the ether. The wind outside, though still howling, lost its biting intensity. The room, once filled with an oppressive energy, now felt oddly still, as though the storm outside was somehow mirrored in the stillness inside the diner. The officer remained on the ground, his breathing shallow, his eyes wide with a mixture of relief and confusion. Marcus approached him cautiously, his mind racing. He had witnessed the full force of the supernatural reckoning, but he wasn't sure what had just happened. Had the officer truly been spared, or had the spirits simply moved on to give him a chance to redeem himself? It didn't matter. What mattered now was that Marcus had been given a role in this, a role that he hadn't anticipated but felt a deep sense of responsibility for. The officer raised his head, his eyes meeting Marcus with an expression of utter defeat. "I don't know how to make this right. I don't know what I can do to atone." Marcus, looking down at him, realized the officer's plight. He had been complicit in a system that had, for so long, turned a blind eye to the suffering of others. But it wasn't too late for him to change. It wasn't too late for anyone. The very fact that the officer had pleaded, that he had expressed regret, was a step toward redemption. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. It was the beginning of change. "You can start by being accountable," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "You can start by doing the right thing now, by helping to undo the damage you've caused. You're not alone in this. The people who suffered, the spirits, they may have moved on, but the work doesn't end here. This town has been built on lies and silence. You have a chance to be a part of making it right." The officer nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I'll do anything. I'll fight for them. I'll fight for what's right." Marcus stepped back, nodding in approval. "Then let's start now. Let's make sure their voices are heard. Let's make sure their stories are told. And let's make sure this town never forgets." The wind outside had finally begun to die down, its fury dissipating into the night. But the storm, the reckoning, had left its mark. There was still much to be done, still much to be repaired. But for the first time, Marcus felt a sense of clarity. The spirits of the past may have been silent, but their message had been loud and clear. Redemption was possible. Transformation was possible. And as long as people were willing to listen, to act, there was always hope for change. Marcus turned toward the officer, his voice steady as he spoke. "Let's make sure we don't waste this chance." The town had quieted, but the air was thick with the unresolved weight of the past. The officer, still sitting on the floor, had now risen to his feet, though his posture remained defeated. Marcus stood beside him, feeling the solemn tension between them. The storm had passed, but its echoes remained, not in the wind, but in the very air around them. Something had shifted. A line had been crossed, and now there was no turning back. The officer stared at the floor, his hands trembling. His face was pale, streaked with sweat, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He hadn't been the one to pull the trigger, but he had been the one who had failed to act, failed to protect those who needed him most. That guilt gnawed at him, heavier than any storm. "What now?" he whispered, his voice almost inaudible. He didn't need to ask what had happened. The question was deeper: what could be done to mend the pieces that had shattered? Marcus turned, his face hard, his eyes meeting the officer's. "Now you face the consequences of your inaction. You take responsibility. You make things right." There was a long silence, the weight of Marcus's words hanging in the air. The officer's chest tightened as if the very thought of accountability was too much to bear. But Marcus knew there was no room for excuses, no time for avoiding the truth. The spirits had been merciful, but that mercy had come with a price. The officer's redemption wasn't a gift, it was a choice. He had to choose to act. The officer's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "But how? What can I possibly do?" Marcus's expression softened, though his voice remained firm. "You begin with the truth. You make sure people know what happened here. You tell them about the past. The lives that were lost because of systems like yours, systems that turned a blind eye to injustice. You tell them what you saw tonight. You tell them about the spirits, about the wrongs that have gone unpunished for too long." The officer's breath hitched as if the thought of exposing the truth was too much to bear. "You want me to expose myself, to tell the world everything I've done?" Marcus nodded. "Yes. Not just you, but everything that this town has hidden, suppressed, denied. If you want redemption, you have to start by giving others a chance at the same. You have to be the change that's needed. You can't run from it anymore. The officer's eyes welled with tears, but his voice remained firm, as if an invisible force was holding him back from fully surrendering to the truth. I didn't know. I didn't realize how deep it went. The system, the prejudice. I was part of it, but I didn't see it. I didn't understand how much damage we were doing until it was too late. Marcus stepped closer, his presence both comforting and imposing. It's never too late. The past is gone, but the future is yours to shape. You can make sure that those who came before you, the ones whose voices were silenced, didn't die in vain. You can make sure they are remembered, that their stories are told. The officer nodded, his shoulders shaking as he took a deep breath, attempting to steady himself. I'll do it. I'll do what it takes to make it right. I don't want to live with this guilt anymore. Marcus studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. It won't be easy. There will be those who resist the truth. There will be those who don't want to hear it. But that's the price of change. You can't undo what's been done, but you can make sure it never happens again. The officer wiped his eyes, steeling himself. I'll speak up. I'll tell everyone what happened. I'll make sure they know what the system did, what I did. I'll stand up for those who couldn't. Marcus nodded, a small sense of pride rising in his chest. It was a long road ahead, but this was the first step. This officer, who had once been an unwilling participant in a corrupt system, was now ready to take responsibility. And that was all that mattered. But as Marcus turned to leave, a thought lingered in his mind. This wasn't just about one officer's redemption. It was about the town itself, the community that had allowed these injustices to fester for so long. The officer had taken the first step, but there was so much more to do. The real work lay ahead, in changing hearts and minds, in creating a culture that valued empathy, equality, and accountability. The officer watched Marcus, his eyes full of determination. Thank you. You've given me a chance to do what's right. I won't waste it. Marcus gave him a final look before turning toward the door. The storm had passed, but the storm inside this town had just begun. As he stepped outside, the wind had died down to a whisper. The clouds that had once blanketed the sky were breaking apart, letting the moon shine through in soft, silvery beams. The town, though still haunted by its past, now had a chance for a future, a chance to heal, to face its demons, and to move forward. Marcus didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for sure: this town would never be the same. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The officer, now standing with more purpose, stepped outside the diner after Marcus. The night was eerily calm, almost as if the town itself were holding its breath. The storm had left its mark, but the air was cleaner now, the oppressive weight of history lifting, at least for the moment. They both stood in the quiet, looking at the town in front of them, its dark streets illuminated only by the pale glow of the moon. You'll need to be strong, Marcus said, his voice low but unwavering. The truth you're about to tell won't be easy for anyone. People don't like their comfort shattered. The officer nodded. He had already started to understand the gravity of his actions, and now, with a clarity that had been absent for so long, he realized that this wasn't just about personal redemption. This was about confronting an entire system, about addressing the town's deeply ingrained prejudices, its failure to acknowledge the lives that had been destroyed by indifference and racism. I've spent my whole career enforcing the laws, the officer began, his voice rough, the words unfamiliar to him. But I never really thought about what the laws were doing to people. I just followed orders. I didn't question it. Now I see how many lives have been ruined because of that. How many lives were stolen. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He simply listened, letting the officer's words settle in the night air, knowing that this moment, raw as it was the first true step toward change. I was a part of the system that hurt people. The officer continued, his voice more steady now. I never realized how deep it went until tonight. I always thought I was doing my job. But tonight, it's like I woke up to everything I ignored. Marcus looked at him, his expression unreadable. The hardest part is facing the truth. But you can't change the past. You can only make sure the future is different. The officer looked down at the ground, his fists clenched. I've seen it all, the hatred, the violence. And I was complicit. I didn't do enough. But I will now. I'll stand up. I'll speak out. A silence stretched between them, the only sound the distant rustling of trees in the breeze. The officer's resolve was growing stronger, but Marcus knew it would take more than words. Action was the true measure of redemption. The people you're going to face, they're not going to forgive you easily. They'll have their own scars, their own pain, Marcus added. But you have to own this. You have to show them that you're willing to fight for the change that's needed. The officer's eyes narrowed with newfound determination. I can't change what I did, but I can make sure it doesn't happen again. I can help rebuild this town, help people see the truth. I can't erase the past, but I'll make sure it's acknowledged. I'll be the one to lead the charge. I won't let them forget. Marcus gave him a sharp look, his voice now carrying the weight of a quiet challenge. Leading the charge is one thing. But true leadership is about standing up for those who can't stand for themselves. You need to advocate for them, help them find their voices. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about giving others the power to fight for their own futures. The officer straightened, his chest expanding with a deep breath. I understand. This is bigger than me. I need to make sure everyone knows the truth, about the past, about what happened here. I won't stop until I make it right. As they stood there, the town ahead of them, Marcus could see the shift in the officer. He was no longer the man who had hidden behind his badge, content to ignore the injustices around him. Now, he was a man willing to expose the darkness, to pull back the veil of silence that had protected so many. Marcus had no illusions that the journey ahead would be easy. There would be resistance. There would be backlash. But it had to happen. It was the only way to move forward. The first step is telling the truth, Marcus said, his voice steady. Start with the people who need to hear it most. They'll be your allies. If you can reach them, you'll find a way to heal this place. The officer nodded, his face resolute. I won't stop. Not until everyone knows what really happened. Not until I've done everything I can to make it right. Marcus's eyes softened, just a fraction, but it was enough to let the officer know that he had done the right thing. The road ahead was long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time, the officer understood that change didn't come easily. It came through struggle, through accountability, through the willingness to confront the past, no matter how painful it was. As they walked down the empty street together, Marcus could feel the weight of history still pressing on the town. But for the first time, it felt like a weight that could be lifted, a burden that could be shared. The officer's decision to act, to stand up and face the truth, was a beginning. The healing could begin now. I'll start tomorrow, the officer said, his voice low, but filled with conviction. I'll make sure everyone knows the truth. And I'll fight for a town that's truly free from the hatred that once defined it. Marcus gave him a nod of approval, watching as the officer's silhouette grew more defined against the faint glow of the town's lights. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like they were moving in the right direction. The officer's past would forever be a part of him. But the future, that was something he could shape. And in that moment, Marcus knew that the officer had chosen to become a part of the solution. And that was a powerful step forward. The officer stood at the edge of the town square, the air thick with the remnants of the storm that had just passed. He felt a sense of unease creeping up his spine. His heart was pounding as he prepared to take the first step in his mission to reveal the truth. His thoughts raced through the night, through everything that had happened, everything he had learned. He was no longer just a part of the system, he was now fighting against it, trying to dismantle it, piece by piece. He looked down at the crumpled piece of paper in his hand. It was a list of names, the victims. The people who had been wronged by the town's history of injustice. The names he had ignored for so long, the names that haunted him now. He didn't know how he was going to face them, but he knew he had to. There was no going back. He had to make the town face the consequences of its actions, and he had to do it in a way that honored the spirits of those who had been lost. As he walked through the town, his boots heavy against the pavement, he noticed how different everything felt. The streets seemed quieter, more somber. The homes, once filled with the comfort of routine, now felt like prisons of history, locked in the past, unwilling to move forward. He could feel the weight of every glance, every word that had been left unsaid. The officer knew that if he was going to make any real change, he couldn't do it alone. He needed allies, people who were willing to stand with him, to expose the truth. He thought of Marcus, who had been the catalyst for this change. Marcus had opened his eyes to what he had been too afraid to see. But now it was his turn to lead. He made his way to the town hall, where the first meeting would take place. It was time to begin the process of healing, but he also knew it was going to be met with resistance. People didn't like their comfort being shaken. They didn't like the idea of facing the past, especially when it meant confronting their own role in the injustices that had been committed. But the officer was prepared. He had no illusions about the difficulty of what he was about to do. As he entered the town hall, the room fell silent. The few remaining people in the town gathered there were suspicious, eyes narrowed as they watched him. He could feel their judgment, their disbelief. They weren't ready to hear what he had to say. But he had no choice. This was the only way. "I need you all to listen," the officer began, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. "There's something you don't know about this town, something that's been buried for far too long. It's time for the truth to come out." The murmurs in the room grew louder, but he continued, pushing forward despite the tension. "For years, this town has ignored the suffering of its people. The lives that were lost, the ones who never got the justice they deserved. We've lived in a lie, and we've allowed the history of this place to continue to haunt us." One of the older men stood up, his face reddening with anger. "What are you talking about? We've always followed the law. We've done what's right." The officer looked him dead in the eye, not backing down. "No, you haven't. You've ignored the truth. You've been complicit in a system that's hurt so many. The law wasn't there to protect them, it was there to protect people like you. And it's time to face that." The room fell silent once again. The officer's words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. The faces in the crowd shifted from anger to uncertainty, their eyes wide with realization. He knew that the hardest part was just beginning, getting them to admit their own role in the town's dark history. "You think you're not part of this?" the officer continued, his voice rising with conviction. "You think you've been innocent bystanders in all of this? You haven't. We've all been complicit. Every single one of us has allowed this to happen. And now, we have to make it right. We have to stop pretending that the past doesn't exist." The words landed with a heavy silence. The officer could see the resistance in the room, but he also saw the flicker of doubt. They weren't used to being challenged, to being told that their actions had consequences. But that was exactly what was needed. The officer knew that they couldn't begin to heal until they first acknowledged the hurt they had caused. "Tonight I saw something I can't unsee," the officer said, his voice quieter now, but still strong. "I saw the spirits of those we've wronged, those who never got justice. They've been waiting for us to acknowledge them, to face what we've done. And now, we have to honor them. We have to start by telling the truth." The room was still, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. The officer felt his own heart beat faster as he waited for the response. He knew he had just opened a door that couldn't be closed again. But it was a door they needed to walk through, no matter how difficult it was. Finally, one of the women in the back spoke, her voice trembling. I don't know if I can face what we've done. It's too much. It's too painful." The officer nodded, understanding her fear. "I know it's hard. But we can't move forward until we do. We can't heal unless we acknowledge the damage we've caused. We owe it to those we've hurt, and we owe it to ourselves." There was another long silence, and then another voice spoke up. "What do we do now?" The officer looked around the room, seeing the faces of people who had never had to confront the truth before. But now they were asking what came next. They were ready, or at least willing to be. "We start by telling the truth," he said, his voice steady. "We start by giving a voice to those who never had one. We face our past, and we move forward together. No more lies. No more silence." It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick. But in that moment, the officer knew that something had shifted. The town wasn't the same anymore. And neither was he. The tension in the room was palpable as the officer stood before the townspeople, their eyes searching him for some sign of hope, some indication that the road ahead wouldn't be as difficult as he had made it sound. But deep down, he knew that redemption was not an easy path to walk. It would take every ounce of their strength, and their willingness to confront the truths they had spent so long avoiding. He saw the skepticism in their eyes, the disbelief that anyone could undo the wrongs that had been so deeply ingrained in their town. But he also saw the flicker of change, a realization that perhaps the only way forward was through the very darkness they had spent so many years hiding from. "We can't change the past," the officer continued, his voice steady and clear. "But we can change how we move forward from here. We have a choice. Each of us has a choice. To confront what we've done, to be accountable, and to make things right." The room was still, and for the first time since the officer had arrived, the townspeople were quiet, each one lost in thought. He could feel the weight of their indecision, but there was something else too. Beneath that hesitation, there was something powerful, the seed of hope. It was fragile, but it was there. The question was whether they would nurture it or let it die before it had a chance to grow. "Start by speaking the truth," the officer urged. "Talk to each other. Talk to the people who have been harmed by the system, and listen. Don't dismiss their pain. Don't hide behind excuses or self-righteousness. It's time to take responsibility." One of the men in the back stood up, his face etched with age and regret. He seemed to hesitate before he spoke, his voice shaking slightly. "I've been part of this town for my whole life. I've seen the things that were done, and I didn't say anything. I didn't speak out when I should have. I didn't stop it. I stood by and let it happen." The officer nodded, his eyes steady. "That's a start. You've acknowledged your part in it. And that's where the healing begins, with honesty." The man's voice faltered. "I'm not sure I know how to fix it. I'm not sure I can." The officer stepped forward slightly, his gaze never leaving the man. "None of us know exactly how to fix it. But we start by being open to change. We start by listening, by learning, by making amends where we can." A woman in the front row, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "And what about the spirits? The ones who suffered because of us? How do we make it right with them?" The officer sighed, his gaze softening. "We can't undo the past. We can't bring them back. But we can honor them. We can make sure that their suffering is never forgotten. We can ensure that no one else suffers like they did." The words hung heavy in the air. Everyone was thinking, reflecting on their own role in what had happened, their own failure to stand up, to speak out, to confront the darkness in their midst. The officer could see the change happening, not just in the room, but in the faces of those around him. The road ahead was long, but it was no longer a road that they would walk alone. "I'll start by talking to my people," one of the younger men in the room said, his voice firm. "I'll speak out. I'll make sure they know the truth. We can't keep pretending that we didn't know." "That's the first step," the officer said, nodding. "Speak out. Let the truth be heard. And once we've done that, we work together to build something better. It's going to take time. But we have to start." A long silence followed, but this time, it wasn't a silence of avoidance. It was a silence of understanding, of acceptance. The townspeople were starting to grasp the magnitude of what lay ahead, and though the road was daunting, they now saw it as the only way forward. "Whatever happens," the officer continued, "we have to stick together. We have to support each other. This town has been broken for too long, and it's going to take all of us to fix it." The younger man nodded, his expression resolute. We'll do what it takes. We'll face the past and build something better for the future. The officer smiled, a small but genuine smile. That's all I ask? We can do this. But it starts with all of us. It starts now. The room began to stir with quiet conversations, murmurs of agreement, and tentative plans for the next steps. The officer stepped back, watching as the people who had once been so entrenched in their denial and fear began to open up, to take the first steps toward healing. The air in the room was thick with potential, the potential for change, for growth, for a future where the town could be reborn from its own ashes. As the officer left the town hall, he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they had made progress. They had taken the first step towards something better, something more inclusive, more just. It wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, there would be setbacks. But he was no longer fighting alone. They were all in this together. The storm had passed, but the town's journey was just beginning. And the officer knew that as long as they kept moving forward, as long as they kept facing the truth, there was hope. The spirits would be honored, the past would be confronted, and a new legacy would be built. The officer had no illusions about the work ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he believed that it was possible. They could change the town. They could change themselves. And together, they could create a future that honored all people, all voices, and all histories. It was only just beginning.